Good morning. This is our science video for Wednesday, April 22nd. And we're continuing on with our note taking on page 194 in your book, if you want to follow along and see the pictures. Today we're going to be talking first about coral. Do you know what coral is? Look at the picture on the right. It is a picture of coral. You may be wondering why on earth I'm including it in a book about sea animals. Would it surprise you to learn that corals are actually animals? Look. Well, what you actually see in this picture are the remains of hundreds or thousands of once living corals. The coral animals that made these remains are much like tiny sea anemones. Not all corals are tiny. Some are as big as your dad's foot, but most are rather small. Like the anemone, a coral is a polyp that has a tube-like body with a hole in the middle that forms the mouth, and that mouth is surrounded by stinging tentacles. Because they resemble sea anemones, corals are in the same class as sea anemones. Corals then are also called flowers of the sea. The most important difference between sea anemones and coral polyps is that many coral polyps build protective walls around themselves. In other words, they build their own houses. Those houses are left behind when the corals die, and that is what you typically will find on the seashore. Although some people will call these remains coral shells, they are not shells. It is more proper to call them coral skeletons. Each different kind of coral colony builds a different kind of skeleton, resulting in colonies that can be shaped like a brain, a mushroom, a cabbage, or many other things. So you might see a coral that's shaped like a brain. You might see a coral that's shaped like a mushroom. And these are called the coral skeletons when you find them. Because the actual coral lives inside, and this is the coral's house that it's built for itself. With all these corals gathered together, building skeletons around themselves, large structures are formed. We call these coral formations coral reefs. Okay, so what happens is then we have a coral and it builds itself back here and then this one here, and it starts to make this one big structure. And the whole structure we call a coral reef. Okay, and you can see a picture of a coral reef on page 195. And they can be quite colorful and very beautiful to look at. Corals that build hard skeletons around themselves are called stony corals. But it is important to realize that not all corals are stony corals. Some are soft corals, which are soft and can be easily mistaken for plants. We will study those in a moment. The corals, whether stony or soft, come in an amazing variety of beautiful colors. They truly make the tropical waters where they grow a delightful rainbow-colored underwater scene. So we have two types of corals. We have stony corals and we have soft corals. And first we're going to look at the stony coral. Stony corals are typically called reef-building corals because they are largely responsible for making the coral reefs. How do these reefs begin? Well, when a reef-building coral is first attached from an egg, the larva swims around until it finds a place to begin growing. It usually attaches to some rock or another piece of coral. Immediately, the polyp begins to make more polyps by budding. Remember, we learned about budding yesterday. Just like the sea anemone. It does this again and again until there are many, many, many coral polyps. Each coral polyp in the colony is connected to every other coral polyp in the colony through living tissue that stretches from polyp to polyp. So when one polyp catches food, it can send the food particles around so that they feed all of the nearby corals. Those corals can then share with corals near them and on, so that food is passed throughout the colony. In this way, even if one coral polyp catches no food for the day, it will eat when another polyp does. This makes the polyps in a colony dependent on one another for survival. Each coral polyp makes its hard outer skeleton by converting calcium in the water into calcium carbonate, the main component of chalk. The cup-like skeleton grows into different shapes of the coral colony. To capture prey, the individual polyps stick tentacles out of the holes at the top of the cup. When danger approaches, a polyp swiftly pulls back into its cup. Most corals stay in their cups all day and only emerge at night to eat. Can you guess why they feed at night? As I told you in previous lessons, that's when the millions of zooplankton make their way up to the surface of the ocean. Those zooplankton make an easy meal for the corals. Another interesting thing coral polyps do is they capture tiny phytoplankton called zooxanthellae. Zooxanthellae. That's a big word. We'll write it. Zooxanthellae. That's a big word. But interestingly, instead of being eaten, the zooxanthellae are kept inside the coral polyp's body so they can make nutrients for the polyp. The polyp doesn't have to have these nutrients to survive, but they make the polyp healthier. Another thing the zooxanthellae do for the coral is increase the speed with which it can build its outer skeleton. Without zooxanthellae, it would take the coral polyp a lot longer to make its protective home. Of course, the zooxanthellae benefit from this symbiotic relationship as well because they are protected by the coral's outer skeleton. Because zooxanthellae are phytoplankton, they use the light from the sun to make their food. As a result, corals usually live in water that gets a lot of sunlight. You rarely find corals in the deep, dark depths of the ocean where no light penetrates. You also rarely find corals in water that is murky and dark. Rather, you usually find corals in clear water. In addition, coral polyps need warm water to produce their outer skeletons. So the water not only has to be clear, it needs to be warm as well. Another thing the zooxanthellae do for coral is provide the coral with its color. If the zooxanthellae in the coral die, the coral loses its coloring. Scientists call this bleached coral. And if you notice on page 196, you see some parts of the coral that are actually white, and that means that they're called what they call bleached. Okay, that means the zooxanthellae in that part have died. The bleached coral can live without the zooxanthellae, but it will not be nearly as healthy as it could be. If the coral can manage to capture more zooxanthellae, it will return to its normal color. Okay? Eventually, a coral polyp will die. However, though the animal inside dies, the skeleton will remain. In addition, as a polyp dies, a new polyp from the same colony will be produced by budding, and it will put its new home on top of the dead coral. As time goes on, this process continues, forming a large structure called a coral reef. So if you look on page 197, you'll see a beautiful picture of a coral reef. Okay. Some coral reefs have taken hundreds or even thousands of years to form. The largest coral reef is near Australia, and it's called the Great Barrier Reef. It is more than 1,200 miles long and is several hundred feet thick in some places. Creation scientists estimate that it would have taken about 3,500 years for this reef to grow to the size that it is today. Now remember, even though the Great Barrier Reef is thick, only the topmost layer contains living coral. The rest of the reef is made up of the dead coral remains on which the living corals built their homes. Coral reefs are an important habitat for sea life. Millions of animals depend on the reef for food and protection every day of their lives. Coral reefs are actually like the rainforest of the sea, housing some of the most colorful, exotic animals in the ocean. This makes reefs a favorite spot for divers to visit. Coral reefs support so much sea life because they provide a lot of food for some animals. Crown of thorns, sea stars, nudibranchs, parrotfish, butterfly fish, and other animals eat coral. In addition, coral reefs provide home and safe hideouts for other animals. Coral reefs are dotted with many crevices and holes. Fish, crabs, shrimp, seahorses, and other animals make their homes in those crevices and holes. They try They use those holes to hide from predators. Of course, with all of these animals eating and hiding in coral reefs, large predator fish are attracted to coral reefs, hoping to eat the animals that are eating the coral or find the animals that are hiding in the coral. Okay, and so tomorrow we will finish our chapter, and we'll talk about reefs at risk. We'll talk about the soft corals that we haven't talked about yet, and we'll talk about some non-nettle jellies. Okay, take all your notes.